Our main story tonight concerns restaurants. One of the dumbest things we've used HBO's money to pay for, tied with Russell Crowe's jockstrap, this giant cake, and the contractual day rate of Army Hammer. 3 days plus transportation, by the way. There's not a lot to say. More broadly, we're going to talk about tipping. Lately, we're not just seeing it in restaurants. We're being asked to do it everywhere, and people are fed up.
I'm purchasing an office chair online, and they're asking me if I want to leave a tip.
Are we tipping at drive-thrus?
The airport in New Jersey just asked me to tip at self-checkout. Tip myself? Like, why did all the work? Who am I tipping?
We got froyo last night, and it was serve yourself. Then when I go to pay, the kid at the register is like, they're just gonna ask you a question. And the question says, how much tip do you want to leave? I was like, what the fuck am I tipping you for? It was literally serve yourself. I grabbed the container. I pulled that lever. I even sprinkled the cookie dough bites. If anybody's getting a tip around here, it's me.
OK. First, no one should ever be getting that worked up about frozen yogurt. It is ice cream for people who hate themselves. That said, I do agree that you should be able to tip yourself when you do a good job. In fact, I'm going to start something tonight. I'm putting a little bit of money into this jar every time I make a good joke or a salient point. Watch this space. The point is, people are furious at how often they're seeing the tip screen. It is now the least welcome way to encounter an iPad in public outside of Guy watching Pornhub on the bus. In fact, nearly 3 in 4 people think tipping culture has gotten out of control. There are so many stories of people being asked to tip in weird places, from one woman saying her mortgage company has been asking for tips lately, to another sharing how her Chevy Cruze got towed and when she went to the impound lot and it came time to pay. On the screen, additional gratuity options appeared, and getting asked to tip at an impound lot might seem like the craziest possible example until you see this TikTok of a fully automated coffee kiosk.
You want a fucking tip? Are you serious? You too?
Look, I think we can all agree that is ridiculous, especially because that piece of machinery with googly eyes doesn't want a tip. All it wants is the sweet release of death and to be welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. But newsflash, robot, that's never going to happen. You're not getting into heaven. You know why. Say it with me, folks. You were never baptised. Exactly. Bingo, bango. Enjoy robot hell. Down you go and stay there. The point is, you're not wrong for thinking tip requests are showing up in more places, but as frustrating as that can be, lots of people depend on tips for their livelihood. And this subject took centre stage last year when Trump made this bold promise.
I will eliminate taxes on tips for restaurant workers and hospitality workers and anyone else relying on tips. No more taxes on tips. No taxes on tips. None. None.
Look, Trump may be the most predictable man who has ever lived, but at least he's out there trying to generate suspense at random points in the middle of otherwise normal sentences. Tips! Once every 3 or 4 minutes, he belts out a random word like he's announcing it as the musical guest on Saturday Night Live. But it is true, Trump has promised to eliminate taxes on tips, and Kamala Harris followed suit, adopting a similar proposal. And right now, lawmakers are deciding whether or not this proposal will make it into the budget. But the thing is, tipping's actually a lot more complicated and fraught than you may realise. So given that, tonight, let's talk about tipping. Why we do it, what the problems with it are, and how we might be able to address at least some of them. And let's start with the fact that tipping here is way more pervasive than in most of the world. In Europe, tipping is much less of a norm, while in Japan, it can even be considered embarrassing and awkward. And Americans travelling abroad sometimes do find waitstaff confused if they try and tip, as this man discovered in Amsterdam.
We got a few beers and I left like a 5 on the table, like, oh, you forgot this. I'm like, oh, no, that's for you. I'm like, why? And you know what? If they ask why, it means they're probably getting paid fine. And like, they didn't see that and go, oh, yeah. Like, if you saw somebody in Portland and a 5 was on a table and they didn't know why, they'd be like, all right, $5. That tells you something about the culture of your economy and how you treat your workers.
Right, you know a country is in pretty good shape when their workers turn down free money. We do not need your $5, for we are each given a fair wage and universal healthcare and a beautiful windmill to sleep in at night and all of the tulips that we can eat. Truly, it is paradise here, no? But while it is now mainly known as an American affectation, the origin of tipping is commonly traced back to Tudor England, when visitors to private homes were expected to give sums of money at the end of a visit for service rendered by the host servants. Hundreds of years later, visiting Americans brought the custom back home with them, and it really took off after the Civil War, when some employers hired formerly enslaved people, paid them low wages, and then encouraged customers to leave tips. And I will say, there's consistently been pushback against this practice. William Howard Taft was once referred to as the patron saint of the anti-tip crusaders, which is a fantastic spin on cheap bastard. While Ralph Waldo Emerson complained about tipping for bad service, writing, "I confess with shame that I sometimes succumb and give the dollar. Yet it is a wicked dollar, which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold." And while it is fine to wish you'll one day be strong enough to resist pressure to tip, I'm just going to say it, that guy would have absolutely crumbled in the face of this robot. He'd have signed his house over to that googly-eyed monster, even if it got his order wrong. The anti-tipping movement grew so pervasive in the early 20th century, 6 states passed laws criminalising the practice, but that obviously did not last. And nowadays, tipping is everywhere, though it can seem like no one really understands the rules of when and how much to tip. Even one of the leading academic experts on tipping has said, "I don't know how much you're supposed to tip, and I study this." It's got to the point where some consumers are now opting out of the system altogether, like this guy.
So I'm not tipping anymore. I'm done. I'm out. Used to be you would give a tip if somebody gave exceptional service. When was the last time you got exceptional service anywhere? They made food. You carried it to my table. You got me a Diet Coke. Thank you. That was your job. You don't get 25% because you did your job. And I'm not the bad guy here. I'm not.
Yeah, are you 100% sure about that, though? Because you can be irritated with our current system of tipping, but protesting it by stiffing your server is about as effective as protesting police budgets by flipping off a police dog. He has nothing to do with the policy, and the only one whose life you're making worse is his. Also, between advocating for stiffing waiters and his I Heart Fossil Fuels t-shirt, I'm just going to take a stab here. You might actually be the bad guy. But to understand why just not tipping is such a bad idea, it helps to understand exactly who works for tips and how they get paid. Because while you might primarily think of servers at restaurants, who do make up a large share of those who work for tips, tipped workers can also include casino dealers, doormen, golf caddies, hotel maids, and taxi drivers, among other occupations. In fact, under federal law, workers can be classified as tipped workers if they receive just $30 a month in tips. And that distinction really matters, because in most states, employers can legally pay tipped workers a much lower base wage, as these cartoon graphics will explain.
Here's how it works. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour, but if you're a tipped worker, it's $2.13 per hour, also referred to as the subminimum wage.
Yeah, the federal sub-minimum wage, sometimes called the tipped minimum wage, is just $2.13 an hour. And it's been at that level since 1991. It may be the most depressing thing that we're still having to live with from that year, were it not the exact same year that the Supreme Court was joined by this fucking guy here. The motor coach offer is off the table, by the way. Big mistake. Huge. Now, for what it's worth, many states choose to set a wage higher than that, but only these 7 and a handful of cities have the same minimum wage for tipped and non-tipped workers alike, meaning everywhere else, the expectation is that some workers can be paid less because their tips will make up the difference. But the thing is, $2.13 sometimes isn't even enough to cover payroll taxes, as this worker explains.
In Indiana, you make $2.13 an hour.
$2.13 an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
You don't see a paycheck. Your paycheck literally says, "This is not a check." It says $0. This is not a check.
Because it just goes to taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you're starting at 0.
Right. You can literally be given a check that has "This is not a check" written on it. And come on, who is writing those paychecks? René Magritte? Ceci n'est pas un paycheck, Magritte. Hi, if you're seeing this, you have Explain the Joke to Me toggled on your HBO account. René Magritte was a Belgian surrealist painter whose most famous works include this painting of a pipe with the words "This is not a pipe" beneath it, because, of course, it isn't a pipe. It's a painting. That might seem banal now, but trust me, if you were sitting at a French art museum in 1929, shit like this blew your fucking dome. People were speaking in tongues, throwing up in response. It was a regular Rite of Spring scene. Oh, you hit the button again, huh? Rite of Spring is a work by Igor Stravinsky that was supposedly so avant-garde it caused riots at its first performance. Apparently, Camille Saint-Saëns stormed out of the premiere, although admittedly that claim is now in some dispute. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really do need to get back to the show. Take some fucking balls there, right? The point is, you can make as little as $2.13 an hour. And if what you make up in tips doesn't get you all the way up to minimum wage, theoretically, your employer is supposed to cover the difference through what is called the tip credit. But that can be hard for employers to keep track of, and it's a system that's easy to cheat. It's been said that the tip credit is often abused at the employee's expense, with one restaurant worker saying, "As long as I've been doing this, I have never, ever, not one time, met anyone that's been compensated for a below minimum pay period." So the fact is, a lot of tipped workers' pay may come down to how much someone chooses to leave as gratuity. And if you've ever in your life worked for tips, you know you can do very well, though that can depend on not just where you work, but when you work, or even what mood your customers happen to be in, as this former hospitality worker explains.
If you come in on a Tuesday, I mean, some people party on a Tuesday, but not as much as Saturday. Put yourself in a tip worker's shoes. Could you survive off of $2.50 an hour and rely on the drunk guy in front of you to pay your rent?
Right, someone's ability to pay their rent can be dependent on a person who may be drunk or partying on a Tuesday, or if they happen to be the current defence secretary, very likely both. and all this might help explain why recent analyses have found that poverty rates for tipped workers are over twice as high as for non-tipped workers. And some tend to be more disadvantaged by this than others. Studies have found that both black and white consumers tip white servers more than black ones. And one paper found that waitresses in their 30s and those with large breasts, blonde hair and or slender bodies received larger average tips than their counterparts without these characteristics. And look, it is not news that life is somewhat easier for attractive people. I would know. I was featured in Vogue in 2015 in the gallery titled, and this is true, 10 unconventional alternatives to the sexiest man alive, who was, at the time, by the way, David Beckham. You know, life is just different for us, you know, whether you're the sexiest man alive or his, quote, unconventional alternative. But obviously, those higher tips can come with a lot of unwanted harassment, and if servers are making a sub-minimum wage, they might feel especially pressured to put up with that in order to make a living. And there is one final twist here, which is that a server's tips may not even be entirely theirs either. In some restaurants, there's an expectation that servers will tip out or pay a share of their tips to other restaurant personnel, and depending on how that's set up, it can really put servers in a bind. Here's that woman you saw a minute ago explaining how it worked for her.
You have to tip out, I mean, most restaurants is roughly 3 to 5% of your sales. So like, even if people are tipping the 20% that is standard for great service, most servers are tipping out 3 to 5% of that to bussers, hosts, and bartenders.
What if I leave you nothing? What happens?
Then we have to pay that tip out whether you give us money or not. So like, say your bill is $100 and I have to tip out 5% and you don't tip me at all, I'm paying $5 to wait on you out of my own pocket.
That is true. At some places, not only are you subsidising the servers, they may be subsidising other members of staff too. And if that seems less like a business and more like an insane money carousel where everyone is paying everyone else and somehow everyone is still poor, welcome to the restaurant industry. And at this point, you might be thinking, well, fuck this whole system. Why don't we just get rid of it? And you would not be the first to suggest that. Here's that guy you saw earlier gaming out the system that he'd rather see.
If you own a restaurant, just tell me what it costs. I don't want people to go hungry. What does it cost for me to get my food, and also so that the waitstaff doesn't have to join the cartel, do some Lord of the Flies, Oliver Twist? Like, I want people to be taken care of. Just tell me what it costs.
Now, that might sound reasonable, the paying fair price for what I'm getting part, not the absolute avalanche of fearing that waitstaff would join the cartel or do some Lord of the Flies or Oliver Twist-like thing, whatever the fuck that could mean. I don't know what versions of either of those books he's read, but Lord of the Flies and Oliver Twist had some very different answers for what children will get up to when unsupervised. And neither of them seem like they'd apply to workers making the tips minimum wage. But unfortunately, when many people say, just tell me what it costs, They also mean, and it better cost exactly the same or I am going to be pissed. As this tipping expert explains.
I've done the research where I give people hypothetical menus. One where they have regular prices and at the bottom it says a customary tip of 15 to 20% is appreciated. One where they say tipping's not allowed, you can't tip, but their menu prices are 15% higher.
He then asked people how expensive they thought the restaurant was. People overwhelmingly thought the menu with the 15% higher prices was more expensive than a menu where they would tip 15% or more anyway.
Yeah, even if the amount of money coming out of your pocket is the exact same both times, people view the menu with the built-in tip prices as more expensive because it just feels more expensive. It's sort of the same way that it feels like I'm older than David Beckham, even though, fun fact, I'm 2 years younger than him. He is aging incredibly, and I think I'm pickling. I deserve that. And that has led people to try and come up with other ways to relieve the financial stress on tipped workers, which brings us all the way back to Trump's promise to eliminate taxes on tips. It's an idea that he was proud to reveal had a notable celebrity backer.
On your receipt, when you get your receipt for a restaurant, you know who sent me one? Kid Rock. How good is Kid Rock? Isn't he great? But he sent me a receipt. And he wrote on the receipt, vote for Trump and you won't pay taxes on tips. He wrote that on the receipt. I said, that's very smart. That's very smart. Smart guy. So for restaurant workers, for hotel workers, for caddies, for car people, it's a lot. But anybody receiving tips, there's no more tax on tips. And I think that's going to be a great thing.
OK, there is so much to deal with there, from the phrase car people to, again, the surprise punctuation on caddies, to the fact the president is taking policy advice from Kid Rock, a man who constantly looks like he's on trial for something called moonshine fraud. But the thing is, that idea has broad support. It's a proposal supported by roughly 3 in 4 Republicans, Democrats and independents. And look, I'm all for giving a tax break to low-wage workers, but you should know a lot of economists have major concerns with this particular policy, starting with the fact that the tax relief it gives, it would be haphazard at best.
One of the ways to make taxes fair is to make sure that people of the same income level are paying approximately the same amount of taxes. And in this case, you really wouldn't be doing that. So for example, if you took a delivery worker who delivered food, they probably get tips. And so they would qualify for this tax benefit. If you took a delivery worker who delivered packages, they usually don't. So they wouldn't get a tax benefit. But I can't think of a good reason why you would want to give a tax break to the person who delivers food, but not to the person who delivers mail.
Right, that doesn't make much sense, does it? If someone delivering packages for Amazon makes the same as someone delivering food for DoorDash, it doesn't feel fair for one of them to be taxed significantly more. Although, if we're going to be even fairer, we'd probably tax the guy who owns the company that sends out those packages a fuck ton more as well. But that's not what we're talking about tonight. The point is, Trump's plan would essentially be a tax break for only the 2.5% of American workers who work for tips, and not even all of those, given that more than a third of tipped workers had incomes low enough that they face no federal income tax to begin with. And that's not the only issue with this idea. It's also a policy that could be exploited. For instance, people with higher incomes might find ways to designate some of their wages as tips to avoid paying taxes. And there have been concerns that it could push some employers to restructure their pay to lean more heavily on tips, meaning prompts to tip could start showing up in whole new categories of consumer transactions. So you might actually be prompted to tip even more than you are right now. The point is, while no tax on tips is an easy applause line at rallies, it wouldn't be nearly as effective as it sounds. If you really want to give relief to tipped workers, I'd argue the solution would be to eliminate the sub-minimum wage. Basically, everyone gets at least the minimum wage, and then your tip goes on top of that. It's a proposal that this advocacy group has been pushing for nationwide, but I will acknowledge not everyone is on board with this idea. In Michigan, there's been an ongoing fight over raising its sub-minimum wage, and even some who might stand to benefit do have concerns.
Andrea Souther works hard for her tips.
It's what keeps my lights on. That's what keeps me going back, for sure.
Because she makes tips, her minimum wage is about $4 an hour. Soon that'll change, and she'll make minimum wage like any other worker which right now is roughly $10 an hour in Michigan.
When people start to realize you're making hourly, they'll tip less. They'll be like, well, they're already making their minimum wage, which is 10-something an hour.
Yeah, I could see worrying about that. And while I'm not saying it's the only reason she feels that way, having what seems to be her boss standing 3 feet away, staring daggers at the camera might also have something to do with it. But I do get those concerns, although it is worth remembering there are 7 states that haven't had a sub-minimum wage for decades, and people still tip there. In fact, one study found that tipped workers in those states typically earn 10 to 20% more in wages and tips. And I'm not saying switching over is easy. There are good faith concerns from restaurant owners who are often having to operate on very thin margins about what sudden pay hikes could mean. That's why, in many places where the sub-minimum wage has been eliminated, it's been done gradually so that restaurants can figure out an approach that works for them, like adding a service charge or raising prices slowly. And it's worth knowing where it's been done, the restaurant industry hasn't imploded. Flagstaff, Arizona has been incrementally doing away with its sub-minimum wage since 2017, and both restaurant employment and the number of restaurants in its county have risen. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. is now 2 years into its phase-out, so it's still too early to know the full impact, but numbers currently don't show any obvious problems on the jobs front. There are somewhat fewer bartenders, an increase in waiters and waitresses, and earnings that are broadly consistent with recent years. But maybe the clearest expression of the difference eliminating the sub-minimum wage can make is looking at states that have done it and the neighbouring states that haven't. Just watch as a waitress in Wisconsin, which has a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, is asked about Minnesota, which got rid of it.
What if someone said to you, wow, we're going to be just like your neighbors over there in Minnesota, and you're going to get minimum wage as your base salary, plus your tips?
I would love that. I actually know some people who used to work in Minnesota as a server, and then they came over here and they realized that they're only making $233, and they're like, I'm literally losing thousands of dollars by coming over here in Wisconsin.
That's not great. You shouldn't lose thousands of dollars just because you're in Wisconsin. Especially because those dollars are actually more useful there, because Wisconsin is where the National Mustard Museum is. And it has everything. It sells membership to a Mustard of the Month club and this excellent Poop on You sweatshirts. That's the kind of thing you want some extra cash for. So when you take all of this together, a few things are clear about tipping. First, it's unlikely to ever go away completely. At this point, it's just too culturally ingrained no matter what happens. Second, it just isn't the gratuity that many seem to think it is. In fact, in a lot of places right now, it's an absolute necessity. So if you're eating at a restaurant, you have to tip. And there are other jobs where that might also be the case, up to and including car people and caddies. Now, does that mean you should also be tipping at an impound lot? No, absolutely not. Should you be tipping this robot? Fuck no. That shouldn't happen under any circumstances. That robot should go to hell, and it will. But if you didn't know that workers in most states rely on tips to make up for sub-minimum wages, now you do. And if you'd rather a tip be just a little bonus instead of critical to someone's survival, that's great. That means you support eliminating the sub-minimum wage, and you should feel free to yell at your state and federal lawmakers about it. But if you're considering withholding tips to prove some kind of point about the unfairness of the industry, I hate to say it, you might be the bad guy. Anyway, that is the end of this story, and it's the end of this episode. For those of you at home, your screen's just going to ask you a question real quick. Just go ahead and tap to make your selection. No pressure, but we worked pretty hard. And if you fell asleep, but there is a cat that's still awake in your home, just mash your little paws at the screen. Daddy wants some money. That's our show. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Good night. Not 15. Over here. We'll take the 25, please. We worked hard this week. Get it. Get it. Get it. Get it, cat. 25. 25. Get it. Get it.